You're listening to High Achiever Diet, lifestyle optimization for high performers. Hello, high performers. This is Vytautas, and welcome to High Achiever Diet podcast. If this is your first time listening, thanks for tuning in. To get a hold of show notes or just get in touch, say hello, go to highachieverdiet.com. Besides that, this is episode number 1 to High Achiever Diet. And today we have Lucian Acaru, a Romanian coach who's basically redefining a way to approach prevention of chronic diseases and coaching his clients to lose hundreds of pounds in like a really easy fashion, which is eating more fat, eating less carbohydrate, and then getting lean as a result. We start off with catching up about his recent trek, an endurance event of 100 kilometers, where he spent almost 30 hours trekking with his client in his 60s. And the most interesting fact is that they are powered purely by fat sources. No sugar, no carbohydrates, just fat. So let's start with that, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Hey Lucian, how are you doing?
I'm very well, V, thank you.
Are you all recovered after your 100-kilometer trek?
Yeah, I'm fully recovered. I was about, surprisingly, 80% recovered on the Monday after, after 15 hours of sleep. Despite the fact that at the end of the trek, I felt a bit pretty battered. I didn't believe that I would have recovered so fast. So probably that's, again, due to supportive diet.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but you did it with a client who is in his 60s, right? And he's following one of your disciplines and your kind of approach to diet and lifestyle. How did it go for him?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, he was my inspiration because he performed a similar trek last year in 2015, London to Brighton, which is even tougher. And most impressive, more impressive even, it was the fact that he completed it during Ramadan. So he was fasting. It was hot outside, probably 25 degrees, and he completed this trek during daytime. So basically, he wasn't drinking anything, he wasn't eating anything, which surprised all the medical staff there. They were monitoring him every checkpoint because that goes against all their textbook. Like you need to fuel, you need to hydrate.
Yeah. So wait, he didn't even hydrate for how many hours?
Well, he was working daytime, so probably 12 hours of daylight. So you know how is during Ramadan, you eat before or drink before sunrise and then after sunset.
Okay.
So I'm not exactly sure how long is the day, but about this time, I think it's around 11, 12 hours.
But even if it's, just walking, it's still an endurance event because, you have to fuel on something. So what was his diet like after those 12 hours? What did he replenish it with?
Well, he ate the normal diet. He ate eggs and some meat, I believe, and drinking a lot of water during the night. Like he was drinking 5 liters of water to rehydrate. But that's just during the night. And then, so he took about 26 hours last year, and that's how he did it, without eating and drinking during daytime.
But it means basically he didn't feel on carbohydrate, right?
Well, absolutely, he did not.
So how does that work? For our listeners out there, you're a bit advocate of, high fat, low carbohydrate diet. But anyone who's, following the conventional wisdom, they're going to be scared and really skeptical.
Well, my understanding is that eating a diet that is relatively low in carbohydrate, it's actually the human diet. And the conventional wisdom, or what most people eat, it's actually a diet that is not compatible with human metabolism. Like the high carbohydrate diet is not a human diet. That's what I'm saying. Because if you look at the fuel storage in terms of carbohydrate and fat, for instance, a human, which is carbo loading and carbo eating, can store about 2,000 calories as glycogen in the liver and in the muscle. In terms of fat, they can store, even the leanest individual stores about 120,000 calories. So that's like 50, 60 times more. So if you have a system that you have the choice to fuel, you have this small fuel tank of 2,000 calories, or you choose the bigger tank that is 50, 60 times greater. That's like a no-brainer. Like biology tells us what we are supposed to be fueled on. It's not the dietitians, it's not the nutritionists, it's not these people who have a basically limited understanding of biology.
Yeah, as you're mentioning now, nutritionists and dietitians, I mean, they think that low fat is the way to go, and all the studies with like a limited sample of people which are contradict the thing. What is your take on that? Why are they putting all those skewed facts when in the end you have essential fatty acids, and the word essential is really important in it, right? Because you don't really have essential sugar or essential carbohydrate.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's another biological fact that we have a need to provide from outside the body essential fatty acids and essential amino acids. And our bodies have the ability to manufacture carbohydrate inside through gluconeogenesis, a pathway in the liver. Even if some parts of our body need exclusively to fuel on carbohydrate, on sugar, our liver makes it from protein or fat. So there is no need to ingest it.
Interesting fact number one about Lucian is that, just like myself, he discovered low carbohydrate or restricted carbohydrate lifestyle and practice by simply being exposed to material which didn't make sense and which was not fruitful in giving results clients or himself needed. He estimates that almost 50% of all the material he was presented in degree of sports science and what he's presented as a coach doesn't add up. He started questioning every single study and material given to him as scientifically valuable. Most importantly, he started focusing on not how many calories his clients consume, but what sort of calories.
Coming back to the why are dietitians and nutritionists pushing this approach, I think it stems from a basic misunderstanding of science. Because there are, in nutritional science, there are two types of evidence, one is observational, which is very poor in terms of scientific strength, which means that people are being observed by the researchers, so there is no intervention. And these studies are basically based on questionnaires which are sent or administered every 2 to 4 years. That means that the participants are being asked what have been eating over the past 2 to 4 years. And then they check lots of boxes, and that's their measuring tool. That's how they measure these dietary intakes. And at the opposite end, there is a harder type of science, the mechanistical type of science, the interventional, where people actually are split into groups and researchers try to isolate variables. Like they put one group on a low-fat diet, another group on a high-fat diet, and maybe a third one, they use it as control. So in this type of evidence, all the randomized control trials that have been performed in this manner, they show that the high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet is superior for weight loss and for reduction in cardiovascular risk factors. People's health improve more on a low-carbohydrate diet. And in fact, that was the hard basis on this report that came out just on Monday from the National Obesity Forum and the Public Health Collaborations, which are two independent charities, and that sparked a lot of headlines. And for the first time, probably they stated in the UK here very clearly that people should eat fat and should avoid counting calories or move away from the dogma. So the complete opposite to what the establishment is advocating.
And since you mentioned, a heart disease and all the chronic diseases, which is basic, one of the main illnesses which is responsible for most of deaths in, modern society. Your client base is pretty impressive. Gotten to know you back in the day. Like what impressed me the most was that you had some case studies which basically put your clients who had type 2 diabetes back in remission. So how did that work?
Well, my understanding is that we all sit on a spectrum of insulin resistance, which can range from 25 grams for severely obese or diabetic person to maybe 200 grams for someone who's lean and relatively healthy metabolically. So these people who have diabetes or severe obesity, their metabolism is wrecked. It's in a pretty bad state. So their tolerance to carbohydrate is very low. Anything above that, causes metabolic havoc. So 25, 30 grams is nothing. Basically, it's a slice of bread and a nap during the day. But that being said, they're not getting their carbohydrate from these sources, from fruit and starchy grains. They're getting those little carbohydrates from green leafy vegetables, which are high in antioxidants and vitamins and nutrients. So how does that work? These people restrict their carbohydrate, their individual threshold, and they do it consistently, like day after day after day, for 6 months and forever, basically. Because if they have this condition, insulin resistance, it will always stay with them. That never goes away. So what we change is the environmental trigger. So when people with severe insulin resistance eat a high carbohydrate diet, they develop all sorts of markers. Like obesity is one marker, diabetes is another marker, heart disease is another marker. A lot of people say, and I believe it so, that cancer is another marker of a high carbohydrate diet in people with insulin resistance. And all these markers, because you hear it all the time, obesity is associated with diabetes. Obesity is associated with cancer. Obesity is associated with heart disease. But that doesn't mean that one causes the other. They're just running along. Some people are obese and not diabetics. In fact, 20% probably of type 2 diabetics are lean. So that alone disproves the causality, that one doesn't cause the other.
You know, before you develop any of those symptoms, I mean, is there a way to tell that you're insulin resistant?
Well, yes, there are. There are some quite powerful markers which you can test for. One of them that I would test is glycated hemoglobin, it's called. So there is this molecule in the blood that carries oxygen to all cells, hemoglobin, and you can measure the glycation status. That means the damage made by the sugar spikes. So if this is, to my knowledge, about 5.5, you're eating too much carbohydrate. You need to lower that. Another way to do it, which is a bit more invasive, but people do it every day outside medical supervision, is to ingest a sugary drink, like 75 grams, I think they give you, and then measure insulin response in relation to this sugar load, like after half an hour, 1 hour, 1 hour and a half, and see how much insulin you need to push that sugar load into your cells. So more insulin you need, more insulin resistant you are. And this is how you do it. So you test for this, and then you look at your genetical inheritance. So if your dad has diabetes, then you got it. You got this insulin resistance background, genetic background.
Would you say that only people who have insulin resistance should try high-fat diet? Or is it good for anyone? Should, regular Joe who has no idea if he's insulin resistant, illnesses in his family line and his lineage is anyhow linked to insulin resistance, should they still try it?
Well, myself, for instance, I'm not insulin resistant because I was always lean. I was always, but I was probably on the different end of the spectrum. Like I was sicklish, skinny. And why did I adopt this diet? The one, I cut out the grains, the wheat in particular, because I found out that was affecting my body in a way that was turning my own immune system against me. So I had an autoimmune reaction to gluten and other peptides in the wheat. But then after, why would regular Joe try it, even if they think that they're not insulin resistant? Is because it's a diet that is highly supportive of health and highly supportive of muscular and bone attrition. These are foods that are providing you with, like, which are the foods that I'm talking? It's butter, it's ghee, it's animal fats, it's meat, it's fish, it's green leafy vegetables. So these are foods that are highly nutritious. Compared with grains and starchy vegetables, these are much healthier, because what do the grains provide you with? They provide you with a sugar bowl, which is non-essential for humans.
Interesting fact about Lucian number 2 is what he calls a critical appraisal of the scientific evidence. I found that really interesting, so I tried to drill down and ask, what does that mean? And that means actually that it doesn't matter what comes your way. For example, an online article or someone, your family member or a friend gives you, you automatically would presume that we have the authority to actually impact, and that, if we share, it's important. Or what Lucian says is that you should still question the items that you listen in that way, meaning that there is always a contradictory study which says complete opposite. If there is none, it means that it's not science, because if you cannot disprove it, it's not really evidence. So That's one of the takeaways, I guess, that anyone can apply to their lifestyle, is that don't just believe what we say even in this podcast. Try and look out for yourself, try reading books and then having a multitude of knowledge which you can then distill and see what works for you best.
What people are not being said is that with carbohydrate, you can only do two things. So carbohydrate is sugar and sugar is carbohydrate. That's what I teach my clients, to use this term interchangeably. So with carbohydrate, you can only do two things. If you are insulin sensitive, you can metabolize it as energy. And if you're not, or the other thing is store it as fat. So in order for you to build anything in the human body, like hormones, skin, hair, eyes, brains, anything else, you need fat and protein. So that's why I believe the basis of a human diet should be coming from these macronutrients.
But, I think vegans and vegetarians out there are going to severely disagree with you on that.
To my knowledge, there are a few people who do quite well on a vegan or vegetarian diet. And that is probably, in my understanding, because they have a microbiota in their guts that gets the nutrients from those foods that they eat, the nutrients that they need. But most people, I don't believe they do very well. And there is no evidence, no scientific evidence to support that vegans or vegetarians are in any terms healthier than meat eaters. That kind of evidence that I was talking, even the observational one. And I'm not aware of any randomized control trials that support the fact that they're healthier. I fully agree with them on the ethical aspect of meat, of not eating meat, like not eating meat from these industrially raised animals. So that's one of the things that I support, and my clients try to, and myself also try to eat meat from animals have been raised in a humane and healthy way. So they've been roaming outside. So in this regard, I understand their argument.
Yeah. What's your take on counting calories? Because, that's quite controversial too. That a typical coach would just tell you, okay, skip a meal. What's your take on that?
Well, clearly we have to obey. Humans, like any other thing in this universe, probably has to obey this second law of thermodynamics, that calories in must equal calories out. But in terms of nutrition, calories are actually meaningless, because what I teach my people, what do calories mean? So calories are a measure of heat. That's useful in thermodynamics, but not in nutrition. So if you want to produce some heat, I ask them, what would you do? If you want to heat some water, what would you do? Would you burn an egg? Would you burn a piece of bread? Would you burn that? Would you burn that to produce heat? You would put a kettle on, no? So that's what calories measure. So food has many other values, not just heat value. Food entails a lot of other things, like then the macronutrient content, how that food, does it come from, how that animal or that plant or that organism, that fish or whatever was living, and so on. There's so many other values that food has other than calories, and it's been disproven, this hypothesis that you just count calories and you restrict calorie intake and you lose weight and you maintain this weight loss has been disproven. Because what you actually do when you restrict your calorie intake and eat foods that are low in fat and high in sugar, you actually starve your internal organs of your tissues of the essentials. Yeah, you lose weight, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you get healthier. And in the long term, you bounce back up, because you're always hungry. You're perpetuously hungry when you eat the wrong foods for your metabolism. Opposed to this approach that I coach, like these people that you mentioned with diabetes, severe obesity, that lost 45, 60 kilos and so on and so forth, they ate these foods when they were hungry, or they are eating these foods when they are hungry, and they stop when they're full. And so they never experience hunger. Whenever they're hungry, they eat, and they stop when they're full. As opposed to low-fat dieters, which are always miserable, they're always hungry, and they have a very strong willpower that's had down to them. But I believe that, and clearly, they are damaging their health in the long term by adopting this low-fat approach.
But your clients, aren't they skeptical at first, because you're basically saying different things than a regular trainer or coach would say?
I started this thing about 3 years ago after I graduated from my sports science degree. So when I first started talking about this, people were looking at me like very odd, and it was quite difficult to push these arguments to them. But since then, coached so many people, and it worked in so many cases, and I have so many testimonials that it's rather obvious that this approach works.
Just getting into nitty-gritty, technical stuff. What the listeners also, I think, would want to hear is, like what I found, for example, personally, is that if I'm on high-fat diet, which I do cyclically in my lifestyle, I experience really big boost in my brain capacity. Could you elaborate more of what happens to your brain, for example, and why, brain capacity, focus, and memory increases when you are on high-fat diet?
Well, when you restrict carbohydrate to a sufficiently low level, your metabolism starts switching on the alternative fuel, which I believe is the primary source of fuel. That is fat. Fatty acids are being sent to the liver and broken down into ketone bodies. And these ketone bodies, they are being metabolized at the cellular level to energy, just as glucose is. The mitochondria, after adaptation, they start preferring these molecules, these ketone bodies. So what happens, for instance, why is it that a lot of people report improvement in their ability to focus and so on, stuff related to the brain? This is ketone bodies because they supply a steady state of energy to the brain. So I believe the brain is happier on ketones. Some evidence, very powerful evidence, comes, for instance, from people who suffer from epilepsy. And this diet, ketogenic diet, has been documented in this area since the 1920s. For instance, for kids who have this condition and are medication resistant, like medication doesn't do any good for them, the ketogenic diet can resolve that. So they no longer experience fits.
Interesting fact number 3 from Lucian is how to actually do it right. And most of the experts out there will tell you that it doesn't make sense to just dismiss the glucose, the carbohydrate, and general sugar out of your diet because that's what you run on. That's what your body prefers to. But the fact is, your body doesn't have a choice but to burn the sugar you give it. And the more sugar you give, the more insulin resistant it becomes, meaning that as you age, the chance of you developing a chronic disease increases exponentially. Glucose, on the other hand, is not a scarce resource, and your body is able to produce its own out of the protein and fat through a process called gluconeogenesis.
Do you use any supplements? Like, have you heard of, exogenous ketones? Have you tried those out?
Well, I don't exogenous supplements. In that regards, the only supplements that I take are maybe some minerals like magnesium, zinc, and maybe sometimes some omega-3. But I just measured my blood ketones, beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is this one ketone body in the bloodstream the other morning, just by curiosity, and it was 1.2. That confirms that I'm in a good state of ketosis, even without struggling.
And that's 1.2 millimole, right?
Yeah, that's 1.2 millimole per liter. Anything about 1.5, you're in a sort of degree of more optimal ketosis. And this is actually necessary for these people who have epilepsy or even cancer to prevent fits or remission, or reoccurrence of tumors.
But regular person, would we have to track it if we go on high-fat diet just to know where we are at? Or is it unnecessary?
Well, to most of my clients, I don't track it. But if they wish to do so, if they're curious, which is natural and human, they could. And they can do that with a rather inexpensive device, which is a glucometer, which has also the ability to test for ketone bodies.
Okay.
So yeah, it's rather interesting to test it, because this way you actually have a very reliable measure regarding your metabolic status, whether or not you are in ketosis.
Back from my bodybuilding days, I think everybody had those, where you would just focus on building mass, keeping your body fat low. I remember doing carb refeeds. Once in a while, every couple of weeks, I would have a day where I would refeed carbs on the ketogenic diet. Do you do anything like that?
Well, personally, I don't do it. So I rather trust my brain to do it. I don't schedule it, basically. But if I go somewhere and I see some fruit or something like that, I eat a bit more of that, like in season maybe. But I don't schedule per se.
Because, people probably should know that also if you consume any sugar or fructose, it probably is gonna bounce you off the ketosis, right?
Yeah, it will probably temporarily, or now it depends again on your insulin resistance level. If you are severely insulin resistant, then probably it will bounce you off for another 2 weeks, and that will slow down your weight loss or other goals that you may have. Your diabetic control, it will worsen. But another thing that tends to happen after you adopt this approach, this high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet and strength train, so I think muscular cells are becoming more insulin sensitive. So you could dispose of a bit more glucose, of dietary carbohydrate. You could send them in these cells. You can probably tolerate a bit more, but that's individual. Everything is individual. So there is no one size fits all. You have to experiment, test, and see whether or not it works for you.
And you mentioned 2 weeks. Is that a period what it takes you to reach that ketogenic state where you're fat adapt?
Well, in my experience, by measuring my clients, which were primarily fueled on sugar for most of their lives and grains, yeah, it takes about 3 weeks. I think for females it takes a bit more. For males, tends to work faster.
Lots of people, me included, feel that kind of like a keto flu, which is you basically feel like you're in a flu condition, in those first 3 to 4 days. Then your body shifts, into consuming fat and converting into ketones. Do you have any experience in treating that or overcoming it faster?
It's rather normal to experience these bumps at start by performing such metabolic shift. There are a few tweaks that I tell my clients to do, like they have dizziness or they feel this keto flu that you're mentioning. They could eat a handful of berries, some other low glycemic fruit like that, or they also have to tweak their salt intake, because on this type of diet our kidneys do what they're supposed to do, excrete salt. They should increase their salt intake in order for tissues the brain, to get its sodium.
And just out of interest, what is your daily nutrition plan look like? What for example did you have for this very breakfast this morning?
I rarely eat breakfast. My first meal it's around 1 o'clock, but I eat pretty much the same. I eat meat, fish, eggs, and vegetables.
Do you do like intermittent fasting then?
Well, no, I just don't eat because I'm not hungry. I don't feel the need to eat in the morning. I just drink espresso, times a bulletproof coffee, but otherwise I don't feel hungry. So I just eat when I'm hungry and I stop when I'm full. I try to enjoy every meal, like be satisfied with every meal, like eat delicious food and be healthy. It's not about restricting pleasure, which some people may think.
For some people, pleasure is a tub of ice cream, so it's hard to define that.
Yeah, that's true. When you were all your life running on and being addicted to carbohydrates, then you're actually feeding your brain's addiction, not necessarily your body's health.
Do you do any specific training routines when it comes to physical training?
Well, in this area, we focus on movement because that's what humans do. So they are the most complex movers on this planet, probably. They can do more than any other creature. We're not the fastest runner or the fastest swimmers, but we can do loads and loads and loads of things. And probably one of the reasons why we have such a big brain is movement complexity. That's what I focus on, movement, real natural movement, like fundamental, like squatting, pulling, pushing, jumping, throwing, crawling, inversion, like handstands and so on, these kind of things. Mind, obviously, the limitations of the individuals and their specific conditions. To make it a bit simpler, what I base it on is primarily strength training, using either one's own body weight or all sorts of devices perform strength training.
Just drop like a knowledge bomb. But for those people who are still skeptical but would like to try it out, what would you recommend to do first to transition to fat-adapted lifestyle?
What I would recommend them to do is start reading and informing themselves. And if they choose to do so, to change their lifestyle, they should have relatively good knowledge base and understand that if they do that, they shouldn't do it for just a few days, weeks, or months. Because a lot of people go on this diet for a few days and they think, it's not working for me.
And what books would you recommend or what thought leaders to follow on that that kind of area?
Yeah, one of the best book that they should start with is co-authored by one of my heroes, an professor of exercise science from South Africa. It's called Real Meal Revolution. Was launched there, I think, last year, and it's a very informative book where there's a lot of science at the start, plus got plenty of recipes, very delicious food in there. That's one of them. If they want to go a bit deeper into understanding why we are in such a mess and why the low-fat diet actually doesn't have any scientific support, I would recommend them to read The Big Fat Surprise by Ina Teicholz. Other thought leaders, which are a bit more geeky, probably Gary Taubes or David Asprey, like branch out from there.
I'm not going to take much more of your time. I just have one last question. If you think about it, lots of people are kind of tied to that busy, high-performing lifestyle where we, with their peers, go out, drink, eat out, go to a restaurant. What would you recommend to do in that case? Because, for example, myself, I find it really hard to deal with a social pressure, because if we go to a restaurant which works for everyone but you, what options would you suggest, or what to do in that case?
It's rather difficult to eat out there and on this approach and make the food choices that are healthy. Obviously, you could eat the meat, stuff like that, but the problem is that they marinate them with these toxic oils, the so-called vegetable oils. And go out myself with my partner, and like a lot of times we eat out and then we have cramps and abdominal distress by eating these meals because they cook them with these toxic oils. So yeah, it's rather difficult, but what you could do to minimize that is eat meat basically, or fish, and instead of rice or pasta, ask for salads. Avoid bread, and maybe ask for gluten-free bread if you're gluten sensitive. That's what we do. I'm happy that you asked this question. What I'm in our plan now is to launch a catering business, which will deliver foods that are compatible with this way of eating, and get them delivered in schools, offices,
and that's in London, UK, right?
Yeah, that's in East London.
Nice. So lastly, where can people find more about you and about your initiatives and the Eat Fat Get Lean movement? What would be that homepage?
At the moment, my active website for my personal training business is lucianpt.com. So that's lucianpt.com. eatfatgetlean.co.uk. So probably this will be the base to find me, and then from there they can find the links to social media.
Great stuff. Thank you so much, Lucian. That truly dropped a knowledge bomb, which is really approachable. And I think anyone from advanced people in that high-fat lifestyle, as well as new joiners, will just find it extremely useful. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, P. I'll see you soon.
Yeah, see you.